Welcome to The Forest Garden, a podcast for gardeners who want to upgrade their landscapes into biodiverse food forest systems. On today's episode of The Forest Garden, we have the pleasure of talking with Dan Bensonoff, Director of the Permaculture Initiative at UMass Amherst. Today, we'll be discussing fall mushroom foraging with Dan, who grew up mushroom hunting with his family. He will be introducing several genera of mushrooms that perhaps are lesser known, but are equally as delicious and nutritious. We will also be covering some of the processing and preparation methods of these mushrooms, as well as some interesting recipes and storage methods. Stick with us. Welcome back, everybody, to the Forest Garden podcast. Today, we are very lucky to have Dan Bensonoff, who is the director of the Permaculture Initiative at the University of Massachusetts. He's someone who's super knowledgeable. He is of Russian origin or descent. Is that correct?
Oh, that's a complicated question. Soviet Union, but nowadays I'm from Minsk, which is now part of Belarus.
Gotcha. And we won't maybe get into any of like the global politics side of things with Belarus to come today, but that's important to note because, you know, my being from Italian origin and Irish origin, the sort of cultural things that people brought to the United States, like there wasn't just like a big mushroom foraging aspect of things that got brought here with my family. You know, we like tomatoes, figs, etc. But when I met Dan, he started telling me about some of these different mushrooms that he would go foraging with his family and with his significant other's family, and it really opened my eyes. So that's what today's episode is going to be on. I'm really excited. I'm going to learn a lot. I'm sure all of our listeners will learn a lot. Dan, why don't you just introduce yourself and how you first were kind of tied into permaculture or into wild foods, and we'll just go from there.
Yeah, thank you, Mike. Just a really brief biography. As Mike mentioned, I was born in the former Soviet Union. I immigrated to this country when I was just a baby, not quite 3 years old. But, you know, my whole family came along with me. And I grew up primarily in Connecticut. We took a lot of advantage of the woods there. And I can talk a little bit more about that later. But just to say that, you know, foraging for mushrooms as well as for a variety of berries and a few other things was very much in my family's lineage already. And it was something that we did pretty regularly together. But I grew up in suburbia for quite a while. In fact, you know, when I was in high school, I stopped foraging altogether because, you know, I was too cool for that or just wasn't interested for quite a while. Came back to it when I was in college. I started to get interested in, you know, broadly speaking, sustainability and regeneration, both kind of on a cultural and environmental level. And that led me down a variety of pathways. After college, I spent a while living on an eco-village in Israel, and that was where I got hooked onto permaculture for the first time. I did a PDC there that spanned 6 months and generally lived in an environment where, you know, we were living as much as possible within the resources of the land. So the buildings were made out of cob or adobe. The water was all harvested on site. Roughly half the food or more was grown on site. So it was a very kind of off-grid communal living experience. And that, you know, has shaped a lot of what I've done after. I've been a vegetable farmer for about 5 years, working on a variety of urban, suburban, and somewhat rural farms in Eastern Massachusetts. So I'm, you know, very familiar with that side of things. But I have always been sort of interested in the intersection of food and land and community. So one of the ways in which I kind of practiced permaculture specifically when I lived in the Boston area was by helping to start a group which is now called the Boston Food Forest Coalition. At the time, it was the Eggleston Community Orchard. And essentially, we were trying to reclaim land that had been unused for a long time in urban areas that were in real need of green space. And so we kind of challenged the traditional community garden model where everyone just has their own parcel. Instead, we created common spaces where anyone can come and participate, harvest, or, you know, just enjoy themselves. And so that was kind of what I did for a while there. But I've also done a variety of other things. I'm also a really avid cook and have done culinary classes with high school age kids for a while. I also did some policy work for a while with the NOFA Mass, which is the Northeast Organic Farming Association. And for the last 3 years, more recently, my role at UMass is directing the UMass Permaculture Initiative, which is a program that's been around for about a dozen years now. Our goal is to really create edible landscapes on campus that are focal points for community to gather, for students to learn about self-sufficiency, food production, herbal medicines, beekeeping, mushroom cultivation, and a lot more. And so that's been my kind of primary focus. But I also I live on a homestead in Northampton, just a 1 acre space here where we do a lot of food growing of our own. So that's my life right now, is a lot of time in the garden, a lot of time with students, really kind of focusing on ways that we can work with the land and allow the land to provide for us.
Well said. I will say that was a very humble explanation of all of the things that you do. Dan does a lot more than just that.
Happy to talk in more detail if you'd like about any of those parts.
No, I think I think that any one of those could deserve an entire different episode. I, for my own thesis research, have been doing a lot of mapping of the Boston community orchards and forest gardens, and I had no idea that you were involved with those. I mean, I remember you mentioning that you lived in Boston and that you were like, oh yeah, there's a lot of stuff going on up there, but I didn't know that you were involved. So this may be a discussion for a different day. Let's dive into today's topic.
Yeah, absolutely. Really, my first experience that I remember of being in the woods at all was looking for mushrooms. I was probably 4 years old, I think, the first time I went, maybe 3. I don't remember exactly, but it's one of my first memories, really. My dad is a pretty avid mushroom hunter, but my grandparents on my dad's side were especially interested in mushrooms. And I spent a fair amount of time with them when I was growing up. I remember, I still don't quite understand how they knew, but there was always that time of year. Usually we would go out. They were really interested in the late summer and fall mushrooms. So usually we were going out August through October. And I never quite understood how they knew, but they would just wake up one day. And I swear to God that they must have been just smelling the spores in the air. That was the impression that I got as a kid, at least. Because all of a sudden they would say, okay, today's the day we're going to go look for mushrooms. We would all get in the car. And it's not like we would go to a state park or a state forest. They would just literally pull over on the side of the road in some rural area. And we would just walk into the woods, no trails, no signs. I don't know if it was public or private land. I have no idea how they decided that was the spot. But, they had been in the U.S. a little bit longer than my family, than my parents. They had come in 1980. So I guess in the years between them coming and us arriving in the U.S., they had done a lot of scouting because they seem to have a lot of spots. And so I have these really fond memories of being a really little kid and just exploring the woods, and they would allow me to walk off on my own. We had this ritual where my grandfather taught me how to whistle really loud with an acorn, piercingly loud. I mean, you can hear it from a mile away. So I would be able to walk off, look for mushrooms. Sometimes I was with them, sometimes I wasn't. And, if I ever needed to find them, I would just whistle with this acorn and they would find me or I'd find them. And we would usually come back with, I'm not exaggerating, bags full of mushrooms. We would generally harvest in the paper bags you get from a grocery store. And to me, an average day would yield 3 to 4 full bags of mushrooms. I learned mushrooms, the Russian names, before I learned the English or the Latin names. And I still, think about them through that lens. They would point out the ones that were poisonous. They would point out the ones that were good. And then as soon as we would come back home, we would start to process them pretty much right away. And that was a full day, usually, of going out, picking them early in the morning, and then coming back and processing them. But it was a really joyful experience for me because it was just a way that I could, kind of hang out with my grandparents. It was my kind of a first exposure to just sort of that handwork of processing as well, which I still love doing nowadays in my adult years. And then my grandmother would usually cook up a really grand feast with 3 or 4 or more dishes, all featuring different kinds of mushrooms and different preparations. I wish I, had spent more time asking her a lot of questions in the kitchen. It wasn't really till I became an adult and became really interested in cooking that I started to ask a little bit. Unfortunately, they're now passed away, so I can't ask them anymore. But I do talk to my dad pretty regularly about mushrooms, and we go picking every year still. And so I've been able to really get a lot of information primarily from my grandparents and now from my dad as well. I would say it's not exaggerating to say that picking mushrooms is a national pastime for Eastern and Central Europeans. It's pretty common. I haven't been back to the old country since I was a little kid, but from what my parents have told me, it's pretty common in mushroom season, late summer and fall, to just see hordes of people in the forest, all with their heads bent low, picking, tremendous amounts of mushrooms. Everyone has their spots, of course. Russia is pretty blessed to have a lot of lands, and even as far north of Siberia, there are plentiful mushrooms. So it's pretty common all over the country. And even people who live in cities in Moscow or St. Petersburg, many of them have what's called dachas or cabins in the countryside where they will go. And one of the primary activities there is picking mushrooms. So it's definitely something that I feel like is in my blood. I'm very happy to come from a mycophilic culture, because not only do I still enjoy foraging for mushrooms, but that really led me to becoming interested in foraging more broadly, led me to becoming interested in mushroom cultivation, which I do quite a bit of, both at UMass as part of the permaculture initiative, as well as at home. And just to really explore this extremely bizarre and fascinating kingdom. For a while in high school, while I wasn't foraging, I would still go out to the woods and just photograph mushrooms. That was my artistic stage. And I just found them so beautiful. The color, textures, the variability, the ways in which they would just morph within a day or two. It's something that I find just kind of these architectural marvels of nature. So I've kind of been able to appreciate them from a variety of perspectives because of my family's heritage.
Really fascinating stuff.
So Dan, you mentioned that when you were younger and being taken to these different spots, it almost seemed like a sixth sense that your family had. They knew where to go, when to go. And my sense is that you probably have something similar now. And I'm assuming you can probably maybe communicate some of that better because you have maybe a more in-depth knowledge of the ecosystems and the climate and the local region. So what are some of the things that you use to decide it's the right time to go picking, or that you need to wait a few more weeks?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, first of all, I'd say that I don't want, my grandparents, I think, had a much stronger sense of that. And I still kind of marvel at it. It would always just pop out like, today's the day. And it was never tomorrow or yesterday. It was always, no, it has to be today. I go out into the woods pretty frequently. I do have sort of an internal calendar. It's hard for me to turn it off at this point, but I have this internal calendar of just what's happening in the foraging cycle throughout the year. It's definitely not limited to mushrooms, but although I'm also noticing this year, as probably many have, that it's been a very droughty year here. And even though it's just rained, we've had our first decent rain in a while yesterday, that's not enough to make up for the lack of rain. So I'm actually not very optimistic about this season. But I guess just to say that I'm always thinking about what's happening with the seasons. I'm also noticing what correlations are happening. When goldenrod is in bloom, that's often kind of the beginning of bolete season, for example. So I have these sort of correlations that aren't always in sync, but often tend to be. And that's just from being out a lot and really having that kind of calendar. For anyone who spends a lot of time in the woods or in the fields, they start to make those observations, and every year a little bit stronger. And every year there's obviously these natural changes to those cycles. But I think the more that you're just noticing the landscape itself, not necessarily the specific mushrooms you want, because it's actually kind of, I think, important to step back from them. Sometimes if you're looking too hard, you will not find them. So you have to sort of let go of that a little bit. But also just be curious. I really try not to go into the woods looking for a particular mushroom. I tend to go when that mushroom will probably be plentiful, and I will bring my tools in my basket. And if they happen to be there, wonderful. And if they aren't there, I still have a fantastic walk in the woods, and most likely we'll find something else that's really yummy to eat. So I guess I mentioned that because I don't want people to feel disappointed if they're going out, and especially if they're fairly new to mushroom hunting, thinking that, I'm definitely going to find this mushroom today. And if I don't, I'm going to be a little bit disappointed, because you just don't know what you're going to find. And oftentimes what happens to me is that I go out thinking I'm going to find one particular kind of mushroom, but I will find something else entirely. And that's a reminder to myself of just really letting go of particular expectations. Every time you do find a mushroom that's of interest to you, before you actually just go ahead and harvest it, I think it's really important to just take a step back and make some notes about the ecology, the season, what has been happening weather-wise. Just take some mental notes or write them down on pen and paper. It's also helpful for a while when I was getting back into mushroom hunting after taking a long break, and I was feeling less confident because I hadn't gone with my family for a while. This was right after college. I was doing a lot of sketching of mushrooms and just noting down some characteristics. So any way that you have of kind of stepping back and noticing, okay, this mushroom seems to be growing in an oak pine forest. This one seems to be, primarily surrounded by birches. All of those will just help you to notice patterns, because, many of the mushrooms you're looking for are mycorrhizal. They might have very specific associations with certain trees, with certain forest types. They might prefer sandy soil. In fact, actually, many of them do. So sand plains could be great places to go potentially. They might prefer certain elevations. So all of those things will really help you to hone in over time. And eventually it really becomes second nature. A lot of times I'm walking with my friends in the woods, we're not even mushroom hunting, and I'll just spot something out of the corner of my eye, and they just have no idea how I found it. And I don't really either, other than just note. It's as if I passed a friend in the middle of the street, you all have to notice them. It's hard to walk by your friend and not take notice. Just through familiarity, you start to really take note of what's happening around you.
In terms of the mushroom species that you're foraging for, some of our listeners will know the popular ones. Everybody's obsessed with morels. You can find wine caps while foraging. Personally, I get surprised whenever I find a wine cap because I cultivate them at home. So in my head, I'm like, these things don't exist outside of my backyard. They do. They're a native mushroom. I'm someone who uses identification apps whenever I encounter one, and I do spore prints. And very often there's mushrooms that I encounter that say, technically edible, but people don't eat it, which is a conundrum. Doesn't make any sense to me. Like,
well,
okay,
which people?
Exactly. What does that mean? And am I one of the people who doesn't eat it? Like, how is it prepared? A lot of people have responses, even quote unquote choice edibles, and get upset stomachs and whatever, and that's a very personal thing. But what are your experiences foraging for mushrooms that maybe aren't on the choice edibles list? What are some of the ones that are sort of the standouts for you in terms of your own experiences foraging?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. So I have kind of two sets of mushrooms, those that I inherited from my family, and then there's those that I've learned that are more popular in American mushroom foraging culture. And interestingly, there's kind of species on both ends that the others don't know about. So, for example, some you may be familiar with hen of the woods, or maitake is a very common one here in the fall. And when I go picking with my dad, I shown it to him, and he won't get near it, because it's something that they don't. I guess they didn't have them back in the old country in Belarus. And so he's very afraid of it, even though I've told him multiple times, it is very edible. It's delicious. There's just many that my family wasn't familiar with, because, even though interestingly, and it's kind of baffling, that there's a lot of overlap in mushroom species that exist in Eurasia, certain parts, as well as, here in the Eastern seaboard. But then there are those that don't overlap. And so there's a lot that my family just never taught me about, that I've learned about as an adult. And those are some that maybe a lot of the listeners might be more familiar with: hen of the woods and oysters. morels. But then there's many that I learned in family that for a long time, when I was when I was doubting myself, I would look them up and it would say inedible or, as you were mentioning, not a choice mushroom. And I remember thinking, wait a second, no, these are delicious. And it's, cooking is, I think of it like alchemy. So a lot of this really comes down to what you're doing with it in the kitchen. So I'll give you maybe one example. So that one of the genus that I pick a lot of are the lactarius mushrooms. Lactarius are very common. There's a lot of different species. There, some of which are well known. Saffron milky cap is one that's pretty well known and actually is very common in Spain and other parts of Europe. I didn't hear anyone talking about here. I never saw anyone picking them, and they're plentiful. So torminosis, in Russia we call that volnushka, very common mushroom around here and is almost never listed as an edible species. And that's because you have to process it properly in order for it to be edible. And the processing involves kind of an unusual process, which is you basically soak it in water and you essentially are leaching this bitter, milky sap. So you have to soak it and change the water every day for about 2 weeks before you're ready to eat them. And you don't then just fry them up. Almost always, these are then salted. So you then take them out of the water, you layer them in some kind of a jar or pickling vessel of some kind with salt, usually with garlic, bay leaves, and then you can store it over the winter. And this is actually, I just finished a batch that I made last year. They've been in my fridge for a full year now, and they were still good. So that was a very common technique in Russia for a number of different mushrooms, but especially the lactarius, because they hold up really well. They taste really, really good when they're salted. They ferment a little bit. All those flavors really melt together well. And those would be commonly eaten for breakfast with some boiled potatoes or fried potatoes. That would be one example. The russulas, another genus that is very rarely picked. These are really common mushrooms, come in a lot of different forms. Some of them have red caps, some are green, some are yellow. In the Russian mushroom culture, they are all essentially considered edible. And there's a mystery to me there, because in Russian, russulas are referred to as syrayeshki, which literally translates to raw mushrooms. The theory being, I guess, that they were eaten raw at one point, although we never did. But these are mushrooms that my grandparents, when they would bring them home, they would take them all and they would boil them all in salty water for about 20-30 minutes. And then they would fry them up usually, or sometimes mix them with sour cream and sort of make like a creamy dish with them. There's a number of russulas that are listed as poisonous if you look at a lot of books. So Russula emetica is one that's often listed as a poisonous species. And if you just sauteed it up, it wouldn't kill you, but it would probably make you throw up and shit your pants for a while. So it's all about how you process them afterwards. I think the piece that's missing in the American mushroom foraging tradition is that people just think that you just saute mushrooms, like that's the only preparation. Whereas in Eastern European cuisines, there are definitely mushrooms that you just saute up, right? So if you find some really nice Boletus edulis, king bolete, or porcini mushrooms, chanterelles, a lot of delicate mushrooms, those you could fry up and they'd be great. But more often than not, they were boiled and then fried, they were soaked in water, they were pickled, they were dried. All of those processes change the molecular nature of the mushroom. A lot of them will do a lot of leaching, the same way that, for example, acorns are not edible. If you just pick one up off the grounds, they won't kill you, but they definitely won't taste good. It's the same thing with mushrooms. They just need the proper processing.
Same thing with potatoes. You can't, most people can't eat a raw potato.
Exactly. Yeah. And there's so many accidents of history where, some crop was assimilated into a foreign culture and they didn't necessarily have the technology or the knowledge of how to process it, right? So even, I mean, this is not exactly a poison example, but when corn was first brought over back into Europe after America was colonized, they didn't know about nixtamalization, which is the process of cooking corn in an alkaline solution, which frees up certain amino acids. And so when corn became a staple crop in northern Italy, a lot of people were getting sick because they weren't getting all of the amino acids present in corn. So that they had these major nutrient deficiencies. I can't remember the name of the disease that resulted as part of that. And that was unheard of in the Americas because they had this technology of nixtamalization. And so it's the same thing with mushrooms. I think that, sometimes the knowledge didn't quite carry over. Somebody may have learned, oh yeah, this mushroom's good, but they didn't quite know the full story of how to make it really edible, how to really bring out its best qualities. And so I would really encourage people that there isn't a whole lot of great information about that yet. Sometimes when I'm in need of additional information, I'll just go on Russian YouTube, which is a fantastic resource if you happen to speak Russian, and learning about some of these old world traditions. But I definitely would encourage people to, have an open mind about what is edible. Definitely be careful. I would never eat something that you're not sure about. You have to really, really know what you're doing. But again, a lot of these mushrooms can be transformed through some very simple processing methods.
How often do you remove the skin, like the outer layer from some of these mushrooms? I know there's a few genera that, or maybe it's a specific species. I think it's some in the Suillus genus.
Yes, Suillus.
Do that. I don't know if there's any others, but I imagine it's probably a similar thing where if you don't do that and you didn't know that you were supposed to do that, you could have a pretty bad time.
That's absolutely right. So the only mushrooms that I remove the skin on the cap is in the Suillus. So specifically, I usually am hunting for Suillus luteus, which is also usually referred to as slippery jack because it's very slimy on top. It's not going to poison you. You're not going to die. You may get slightly sick, but probably not too sick if you don't do that. You do have to cook it for the appropriate amount of time. That's really important, really, for all mushrooms. A lot of us grew up, probably, many of you remember the days of when white button mushrooms were just served raw in salads. The thing with all mushrooms is that, first of all, nutritionally, they offer you absolutely nothing if you don't cook them. Cooking breaks down the cell walls that really allow for any nutrition to pass through. And that's definitely true for wild mushrooms. I'd say for wild mushrooms, it's even more important to really cook them down properly. There are a few exceptions where you'd want to really maybe get like a slightly less fried, but generally I cook my mushrooms down pretty well. And yeah, I mean, do your research. Suillus is really the only one I know of, although there are a lot of other examples where there's certain toxins found just in the skin, but some of the other ones I haven't really experimented with removing the skin. They tend not to be mushrooms I'm too familiar with eating, so I sometimes pass them over. But yeah, I think that's a really important point, Ben. Just that there's really simple ways in which you can manipulate these foods and make them really work for you.
Since we're on the topic of cooking, maybe you can settle the debate in terms of when you're pan frying or sautéing mushrooms. Oil, no oil, water. Do you have any opinions?
I have some opinions. Yeah, I'm not going to settle it because to each their own. But yeah, so there's kind of the dry saute method, and then there's the just cooking it in oil. So first of all, the way that I grew up eating mushrooms, because a lot of them were boiled ahead of time. Interestingly, you would think that boiling would actually increase the amount of water, but in fact, it actually reduces the amount of liquid in the mushrooms. So it actually to then just oil saute them, because the whole reason for the dry saute is to remove moisture from the mushrooms before you add the oil so that you can get a really nice sear on them. And so I don't usually do the dry saute, although I know people who swear by it, and there's many ways up this mountain. But I will often boil them for a bit to reduce the amount of moisture and then sometimes I'll put them on the skillet to dry out a little bit and then I'll add the oil, but oftentimes I'll just throw them in with oil. But I do cook them down for a while. I want to really concentrate their flavors. That's really, really key for most mushrooms. Chanterelles, maybe do a slightly shorter saute, like chanterelles, black trumpets. Those are really fragile mushrooms. You don't have to cook them for a really long time. Boletes, sometimes I'll cook for a little bit less depending on what kind of bolete, but mostly I am cooking them down for quite a while, and I just much prefer the flavor. And then, mushrooms, there's a whole range of flavors you can get out of them. And, that there's a mushroom called the candy cat mushroom, which is prized because it has that kind of sweet flavor. There's mushrooms that taste like cherries. There's mushrooms that, have this deep, herby, woodsy flavor. There's fruity mushrooms. So there's so many different flavors. But I would say, there are some recipes that you can kind of use as catch-alls when cooking mushrooms. One of my favorite ways of just kind of preserving, if I have a whole bunch and I want to cook them down, is to make I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it correctly, but a French, we'd call it a duxelle, or maybe duxelle. I'm not exactly sure how it's pronounced, but it's basically like almost like a tapenade with mushrooms, usually sauteed in oil for a long time, really concentrating them down, adding some shallots, oftentimes, usually some cooking wine, sherry wine, white wine, something like that. And then you can take that and just put it on a piece of really crusty bread. You can freeze it and then throw it into a stew. And it's really versatile, and it's just a really good way. You can mix up a whole bunch of different kinds of mushrooms. You don't have to be too specific, and it works pretty well for a lot of different ones.
My mouth is watering. I am very excited to get out there and start foraging. So in terms of species, we've talked a lot about genera and, Lactarius, Rusula, Suillus, some genera that are in the fringes. They're not in the choice edible mushroom category, and there's no documentaries being made about them, perhaps. But for our listeners, what are some of your favorite species? Like, if we're going to cut it down to just specific mushrooms that you've foraged for and really, really love the cooking, I'd like to know, what those species are.
Yeah. I kind of crave different ones at different times of year, but some of the ones that people would be familiar with around here, black trumpets are one of my absolute favorites. They tend to be kind of a midsummer mushroom. They can be really plentiful if it's been a wet year. They're just, they're so flavorful, really versatile too. They make great dried mushrooms that, you can throw in all sorts of different dishes. I've also even had a chocolate cake made with black truffles that was out of this world. So that's a really good one. Honey mushrooms, which are going to be coming up, which are in the genus Armillaria. There's a couple different species there, but generally speaking, I actually don't really often talk in species when it comes to mushrooms, only because there's so much confusion over what species are which, and there's been so many name changes. I prefer common names and genuses because they're a little bit more consistent. But Armillaria is definitely one that I would really recommend people get to know. It's a parasitic mushroom, generally grows on dead or dying trees, often on stumps, and it is extremely plentiful. The flavor is pretty good. It's not the most flavorful, but the thing that I really like about them is the texture. They're very stout mushrooms. They don't break apart easily. They really hold their own, and they make really good pickled mushrooms. They're really one of my favorites for putting into either a salt brine or a vinegar brine. They just hold up really, really well. So definitely recommend that one. I do really like some of the Lactarius mushrooms. I mentioned Lactarius torminosus, Lactarius deliciosus, which is the saffron milky cap, is really, really good. Lactarius volimus, which I actually don't remember if it has a common name. It might, is also fantastic. And again, those do need processing. And I just want to also mention that there's, we'll get back to your question in a sec, Mike, if you want some more, but one trick that my dad taught me, which I don't see too many people trying here, maybe out of fears. Whenever I encounter mushroom, I just put a little bit of the cut ends or just the tiniest nibble of the cap onto my tongue to notice the flavors. There's a lot of fear in certain mushroom families, the boletes, for example. There are some boletes that are considered poisonous. Again, most of them are not deadly, but you don't want to eat them because they will cause gastrointestinal distress. It can be really confusing if you look at a guidebook as to which ones are poisonous and which ones are not. But honestly, a lot of times, noticing whether the taste is extremely bitter or peppery or acrid will be one way that you can guide your decisions. The bolete and the rusula is another one that you can try that with. There are some rusulas that are truly, truly so peppery that they will make you want to spit it out immediately. So you can use that to your advantage when you're picking mushrooms. But so a couple other mushrooms that I really like. Again, I don't know the species name. There's many species within this genus, but the Lexinum genus, which is it's one of the bolete relatives. It has that spongy underside, just like the boletes do, but it is its own genus. In Russian, they're called podosinovi, and they're really, really good. Any kind of bolete or Lexinum, they're all really great as dried mushrooms. They concentrate their flavors so well. I actually almost prefer them dried to fresh. So those are some of my favorites. And of course, some of the really common polypore mushrooms that we pick. Chicken of the woods is very nice. But honestly, if I'm going to find one mushroom, it might have to be hen of the woods. It's, the joy of finding a 30-pound mushroom is very special. They are extremely versatile in the kitchen. I love their flavor. I love using them in a variety of different ways. Last year, I dried a whole bunch and powdered them, and we've been using it to make kind of dashi, like different broths, and just been adding such nice richness to everything we make. So that's one that I really, really love. Of the spring mushrooms, I wish I could find more morels. I found 3 individuals this year. They're not very common in Massachusetts. I have found a lot when I lived down in the mid-Atlantic, but I don't find too many around here these days. There's a couple other spring mushrooms, none of which are my favorite, but Dryad Saddle is one that I'd like to experiment a little bit more with. I think it's one that, it wasn't one that my family picked, but I have a suspicion that a lot of these mushrooms that may not be very good on first try just need the right processing. And so I'm going to keep trying with a few of those. Other mushrooms hedgehog mushroom. I haven't mentioned hedgehogs. Hydnum is the genus. I don't remember the species name off the top of my head. Those are so, so wonderful. They tend to come out around the same time as chanterelle, so August-ish, maybe late July. I often find them, when I lived in Eastern Massachusetts, I would find them in sandier coastal forests, so kind of sandy pine woods. And they're just really gentle, not overpowering, have a really nice texture. And those you can just fry up really simply. They don't really need much preparation at all. I would say, those are some of my favorites. I wish I liked wine caps more. I don't really like them a whole lot, unfortunately. But that's one that perhaps, Mike, you can teach me to love, because I haven't quite cracked the code of how to make that one taste good.
I'm surprised. So in terms of the wine caps, when I first was growing them, I kind of thought of them as a replacement for portobellos that my family would purchase at the grocery store. And so much of forest gardening was just growing things to replace something you would buy in the summer or the winter or whatever at the grocery store. We have giant, delicious burger replacements of wine caps, and they were amazing. And then suddenly, only in the past few months, I had one that just had this incredible peanut butter flavor, like this really nutty flavor that Ben had told me before. He was like, I've always thought that wine caps tasted nutty. And I don't know what the circumstances were that made the thing that I had taste nutty, but it did. And it almost turned me off. I was like, previously I was just thinking of this as this protein rich sort of meat substitute where I can eat a burger of it and really enjoy it. And it doesn't taste like a Reese's cup, but I don't know what the circumstances are that make those flavors change or what the peanut butter flavor comes from, but I will say the nutty flavor was almost a negative for me. But some I've had that didn't taste like anything nutty, and I think it's really the context of what you're eating it with and how it's prepared and whatever. That's really my next question is, when it comes to processing, I mean, making sauces, I know, is an Eastern European thing from a friend of mine who's Polish. And when we have an abundance of wine caps, I'll give her just bags and bags of wine caps. And they're so grateful because they'll make the most delicious sauce that I could never make myself. Like in terms of, even when it comes to some of these more well-known mushrooms or quote unquote choice edible mushrooms, what are the favorite processing methods that you've utilized that could maybe be beneficial to our listeners?
Well, I mean, for one thing, I'd say like quantity matters, right? I'm much more willing to process stuff if there's going to be a lot of it, because I know it's going to be worth my time. If I have a handful of a mushroom, it's really hard to convince me to, make, I don't know, to soak it for 10 days and change the water. But a lot of times, if you have a lot, it really is worth your time. This is a cultural thing. Like, I mean, in Russia, nobody thinks much of leaching their lactarius mushrooms because they know that it's going to feed them for the whole year oftentimes. And it's such an important part of the cuisine. It matches so well with the other foods. But, there are simpler ways. Drying mushrooms is so valuable. It concentrates their flavors and makes them extremely easy to store. It reduces the actual bulkiness of them really dramatically. They are 90-ish% water. So that's a really easy way. In fact, it actually also detoxifies a lot of mushrooms. And I think there's a lot more that I'd like to learn about, which mushrooms that maybe wouldn't otherwise be edible at all. I imagine that just drying them may make a lot of them quite edible. But that's something that I think, we can do more research on. I think, to me, salt brine pickles are really easy. Usually you would parboil the mushrooms a bit, and that just, again, to reduce the amount of water in them to begin with. And then you're just throwing the mushrooms in a salt brine, just like you would do with pickles. And you're throwing in some aromatics, some garlic, usually some herbs if you like that, peppercorn, that kind of thing. Leave them out for a little bit, or you can put them right in the fridge if you want. It's really easy. And once you get in the habit of it, it becomes very second nature. Other than that, I mean, yeah, I mentioned earlier, kind of with the drying, powdering is really useful, because then you can really treat it more like a spice rather than an ingredient, which I find really useful in adding just like a hint of umami to whatever you're making. And you could really have some fun with that. I had some chocolates, like really nice chocolate truffles that somebody gave me that they had made with saffron milky cap, I believe it was, that had been powdered. And they were fantastic. They were so good. They had this kind of hint of woodsiness to them. So you can really kind of experiment and play around quite a bit with that too. Other ways that I would say, like, it really came down to, there was a lot of kind of very creamy dishes. You mentioned that there was a sauce. There's also kind of different iterations of mushrooms with sour cream, mushrooms with cream, mushrooms boiled down with any kind of milky substance is very, very common, because mushrooms love fat. Add a lot of butter, add whatever, bacon, any way that you can get a lot of fat into your mushrooms, you're going to absolutely appreciate it much more. So, I think just kind of finding those pairings is really useful.
First off, I'm getting kind of hungry from this conversation, and I was thinking, I'll tell just a quick story. I'm reminded of last year, which was probably my most successful mushroom year. I had some friends who showed me some great spots in Missouri where I was living at the time. Just had plenty of time to explore the area, and it was just a good year for mushrooms. And I stumbled across, I guess you'd call it a honey hole for oyster mushrooms, which is not something I've done a lot of foraging of. And I wouldn't even call it foraging. It was like almost going to the grocery store. I showed up, and they were growing on all these downed logs by this hiking path, very, very easy, which I appreciated. But it made me think, I don't know if it's the fact that the conditions were right, or maybe it's these giant, dinner plate size tender oyster mushrooms.
Mm.
Something about the genetics of what I'm finding that might also be like improved or be preferable over, other kinds. And that made me think, okay, well, can I propagate this somehow? So I'm wondering, have you ever, I know you do mushroom cultivation too. Have you ever experimented with collecting, like wild collecting spores or tissue to then propagate or cultivate?
Yeah, I've tried. It is challenging. I mean, there's kind of passive ways of doing that, and then there's very active ways of doing that. Passively, if you're walking around with a basket, you are doing those mushrooms a big favor because you're spreading spores everywhere you go. So just something as simple as making sure you have the right vessel. Don't use a bag, grab a basket. All of a sudden, you're going to be spreading spores whenever you walk around with your mushrooms. That's, the most passive. And then you can make a mushroom slurry, a spore slurry, where basically you soak really mature mushrooms, and they have to be very mature because you want them to be releasing maximum amount of spores in a bunch of water. Some people will also add a little bit of molasses, which will kind of feed them a little bit, I guess, although I'm not quite sure why. But yeah, I have basically just kind of dunked them in water, given them a good spin, and then taken that water and put it into strategic places. Honestly, I can't say if it worked at all because, you'd have to come back within probably a couple years later, right? So a lot of times those mushrooms wouldn't then pop out for quite a while. So it's something that, I think maybe requires a little bit of faith. I don't know how much research there's really been done in it, but I know that, there's other ways that people have kind of ingeniously thought of propagating wild mushrooms. So I think Paul Stamets came up with and basically used vegetable oil as a carrier for spores of various wild mushrooms, some of which were edible, others were not. And that was used in chainsaw oil, which by the way, if anyone uses chainsaws, all you need is vegetable oil. You don't need special chainsaw oil. But that vegetable oil, if you have spores in it, every time you cut a tree down, if you're choosing the right kind of mushroom that's going to favor freshly cut trees, so mostly we're talking about saprophytes, mushrooms that live on dead or dying material, then you might be able to get some mushrooms growing out of that. Very passive also. If you want to get really, a little bit more active, you could try to isolate some of those cultures, but that gets a little bit more technical where you're growing it out on agar in a petri dish, and then you have to isolate the different cultures. And, I have done some of that, but it's, I think maybe beyond the scope of what most people want to do because you need sterile conditions. So I tend to kind of maybe go with the fairy approach of just like sprinkling a bunch of spores around in the hopes that, something will magically pop up one day. But I also don't have, I don't know for sure if it works or not.
Let's not forget the mushroom butt approach.
Oh, yes. Right. Yeah.
Let's say that you find the most incredible strain of wine caps in your New England natural forest, and you harvest it by not cutting it at the base, but pulling it out. You can just take those butts that still have the mycelium attached to it and put it in some wood chips, and then bam. In my experience, you have a whole new strain of mushrooms.
That's right. Yeah. That works really well for rhizomorphic mushrooms, where when you pull it out by the butt, you can usually you'll see these strands of mycelium just dangling off of it. Doesn't work for the non-rhizomorphic mushrooms as well. But yeah, wine cap is a really, really good example of one that just will take off. Oysters, buy an oyster from a supermarket and propagate it on cardboard or any kind of carbon-based material. So there are some that are really, really easy. And I think oysters are really worth a shot in kind of these low-tech methods because they're just so omnivorous and voracious. But then, the mycorrhizal mushrooms, I think that the best you can do is hope to spread some spores and maybe say a few prayers because it's really, really hard to propagate most of them. Although there are people who've had great luck, although usually it's after many, many years of a lot of trial and error.
So Dan, I have just one last question. In the past, you've talked about the experiences of foraging with your wife and her family. I'm wondering,
what you might have learned from that experience, or if there's any sort of shared knowledge between the Russian diaspora and maybe the East Asian diaspora, if there's any crossover there. I imagine there would be, but I don't know anything about it. So yeah, what was that like?
That's a great question. Yeah, so my wife Kokoro is born and raised a couple hours outside of Tokyo, and she didn't do a lot of mushroom hunting herself growing up, but Japan has a really, really rich connection with mushrooms, and I've had the privilege to go over there 3 times now, and I've had some interesting mushroom encounters. I had heard of, but didn't have any experience with matsutake growing up. It's not one that is common in Russian mushroom cultures, but is really prized in Japan. It's actually one of the most important gifts that businessmen give to each other. They're extremely expensive mushrooms. As an individual mushroom, they'll come in a really fancy wooden box, wrapped beautifully, costing a lot of money. And they are something that you can find in the woods in Japan. And the second time that we went down there, we were staying in a very rural area there. And we were staying at kind of an Airbnb type place. We were there with the folks who lived there. Amazingly, this family had lived in the same house for 300 years. They said 20 generations or so have lived in this one house. It's this beautiful thatched roof house. They have a lot of really interesting kind of mushroom experience. The person who lives there, he was in his 60s. He took us out for a matsutake walk. And unfortunately, we didn't find any on that walk, but he still had some that he had found earlier, which he shared with us. And they were extremely delectable. But one of the more interesting encounters was that he actually also grows shiitake mushrooms where he lives in the same method that we would use here for outdoor production, where you grow them on logs. But he was complaining to me, and I got a chance to see a little bit of this, is that the monkeys were coming from the forest and actually eating all of his shiitake mushrooms, which I had no idea that was going to be a problem. But that is an issue there, which was interesting. But the other thing that you often see in Japan, if you're just walking around in the forest, there's a lot of, especially older folks who are really into this tradition. They're just out there scouting, often months before it's even mushroom season. I remember we encountered one elderly gentleman who looked like he had probably been mushroom hunting for, 60, 70 years. He was poking around with the stick. And I just, asked him, what are you looking for? What are you doing? And he said he's looking for signs of mushrooms before they even come out. Unfortunately, he didn't speak any English, so I didn't get too deep in with him what those signs were. But it seemed to me like they have a really well-developed system for kind of noticing where mushrooms are going to be popping out in season, even, months ahead of time, which I would love to go back and learn more about. So yeah, there's a really interesting complementariness to it. We definitely, I'm lucky that my wife loves mushrooms. We eat mushrooms as much as we can, and they're extremely well suited for Japanese cooking too, because again, those kind of umami flavors are really, really crucial for their food. Yeah, I've had some really nice outings there. I really hoped a seasoned Japanese mushroom forager on my next visit out there.
Well, Dan, thank you so much for joining us. This has been really eye-opening, and I look forward to the next mushroom foray that perhaps we go on together. I mean, there's a huge disconnect between the popular or modern American foraging mindset and everyone else in the world. And I think that's really enlightening.
Yeah, I appreciate both of you taking this time to talk about one of my favorite areas of exploration. And yeah, I hope that whether people just go out and, appreciate mushrooms around them, or whether they're interested in giving them a try in the kitchen, we're blessed with a beautiful forest here in the Northeast. And I think that this is one way that we can really start to kind of get acquainted with our landscape.
This has been really fantastic. Ben, do you have any last statements?
No, I just wanted to thank Dan as well for coming on. And we don't really get a chance to talk and go deep on some of these mushroom species and these different cultural practices too. So this was a treat for me. and I think you brought a lot of interesting information out there.
Yeah. No, thank you again, Dan. And to anybody who's interested in learning more about what our guest here does, check out the Permaculture Initiative at University of Massachusetts on Instagram as UMass Permaculture. Thank you for staying with us and have a good night.